It's all happened to us. At one time or another, you're working with an athlete, giving them verbal cues to achieve a correct position, but they just can't connect the dots. So what do? 9 times out of 10, I look to constraints-based coaching to achieve the desired outcome. By constraining the environment around the athlete, this helps guide them into the appropriate positions, all the while enforcing with the verbal cues. Today, we're going to look at the hip hinge. The hip hinge is a common movement you might introduce in a strength and conditioning environment at the collegiate level. And often we'll see errors in the movement pattern and dissociations between demonstration, verbal cueing, and the desired outcome. You might see too much knee bending instead of hip hinging, and inappropriate distribution of weight at the feet due to leading forward with the shoulders rather than leading backwards with the hips. So today, together with Taylor Reed, our sports performance intern coach, we're going to show you 6 different examples of how to constrain the environment to achieve the desired outcomes of the movement. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the knee joint. A very common error you might see in a novice performing a hip hinge is too much knee bend and slacking the hamstring at the level of the knee. Obviously with hinging, what we're trying to do is train and load the posterior chain. So the hamstring being a big part of that, we want to make sure we keep good tension on that. So Taylor's going to demonstrate as an example what you might see a novice athlete doing. So she has a good hip hinge to begin with, but then as she gets lower down, tension maintained on the hamstring, the knees start to bend and she starts to squat her hinge, right? So this is what we're trying to avoid. So we can use a constraints-based approach. Maybe our cues haven't worked very well to help her achieve the desired outcomes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Taylor to approach the bench here. She's going to have both feet positioned underneath the bench evenly. Her toes are parallel, her heels are parallel. We've talked about her stance. She's got that down, right? You can see her knees are about 2 to 3 inches away from the bench, not too far away, but not super close to the bench. And all I'm going to ask her to do at that position is just unlock her knees slightly as if she's sitting on a really high stool, okay? So she's unlocked her knees. They're not completely locked out. And now we can start to look at the hip hinge movement. So with her hands on her side, we've already kind of talked about how we need to lead with the hips backwards. So she's going to go through a hip hinge. But now what's happening is we're constraining the space in front of her knees, right? So she's going to be looking down. This is the first progression. She's looking down, observing the space between her knees and the bench. And so she's trying to maintain that gap, okay? So it's not trying to get any bigger, and she's certainly not trying to touch her knees to the bench, okay? So we'll just go for 5 reps here. Okay, she's looking down, she's observing the knees, she gets a bit better every time. Trying to keep her knees as close to the bench as possible without touching it, without getting locked out backwards. And we can immediately see that that knee bend isn't really occurring at the bottom of that hip hinge. Okay? So that's our first one. Our second progression, once she can observe that space and she's got a handle of what that's supposed to feel like, then we can say maintain a neutral head, neck, spine. She's going to be observing forward, and now she's using the proprioception and the tension on her hamstring to inform her that her knee isn't moving forward and slacking her hamstring. Okay, and obviously if she does go too far, the bench is there to reinforce the fact that her knees have drifted forward. Okay, so now we're going to move on from the bench. This is a slight progression. We're going to start using this high plyo hurdle right now to achieve a similar outcome. With the bench, this is a little cumbersome. It's a big piece of equipment, and you can't really use a loaded position, so you couldn't use a barbell with plates on the outside because the bench is obstructive and gets in the way. So here we can use the hurdle, a little bit less obstructive, but still constrains the environment and provides the appropriate feedback to the athlete, and we could effectively load this as well. So very short. All we're going to do, exactly the same as the bench, we approach the hurdle, feet are inside. I'll ask her to stand a little bit closer probably. Now this is doing the same thing, even though it's constraining the shin, right? We talk about that a lot of the time in our Olympic lifts, making the shin vertical, okay? It's constraining the shin, but that is effectively constraining the knee joint as well, as if the knee was bent, the knee would translate forward and the shank would translate forward too. All right, so exactly the same thing here. She's trying not to have her shins touch the hurdle, and she's trying not to lock out her legs backwards. So again, 5 reps, just seeing how that would work. trying to maintain that space between the shin. Again, you can progress it with, have the athlete look down, observe the space between the hurdle and the shin versus looking forward and getting that proprioceptive feedback from the hamstring. Okay, so we've taken care of the issues that you might see at the knee through constraints-based coaching. Now we're going to take care of what you might see at the shoulder, which is really initiated at the hips. So we'll look at that and we'll constrain the environment around the athlete again to hopefully put them into the correct positions. Okay, so this is what you might see again with the novice athlete is maybe we've got the knee bend down now. They're able to maintain tension on their hamstring and keep their shank vertical. But now you might see that they lead with their shoulder. So see Taylor here is really initiating, leading forwards with her shoulder. The weight is distributed on her foot more so to the forefoot. As she leans forward the shoulder, weight's moving here and then back to the middle as she stands erect, right? And that's not what we want to do because what's going to happen is all the load will be placed on her spinal erectors and really we want it to come back to the glutes and the hamstrings instead, okay? So we're going to constrain the environment in front of her now. So as a coach, by using a PVC dowel or a bar or even just your body as a piece of obstruction in front of them, you can help them to distribute the weight towards the back of their feet by initiating with their hips and reaching back towards the wall behind them. So Taylor starts off with an erroneous movement pattern where she's really reaching forward with her shoulders, getting towards her toes. I'm going to start moving this PVC pipe in closer and instruct her not to touch the PVC pipe with her shoulder. So in doing so, she really has to reach backwards with her hips. And now I can see when she gets to the bottom, I'm going to tell her to stop there. Okay, wiggle your toes. Okay, really easy for her to wiggle her toes now because the weight is towards the back of her foot. One more, get even closer, challenge her. Good, really has to push her hips backwards. Good. Okay, so the last three movements we've looked at, they've been very stationary movements, pretty simple movements in terms of the hip hinge. But now when we move on to a more dynamic movement, like the kettlebell swing, often you see those little movement areas creeping back in again, and it's often difficult to correct those movements during such a dynamic series. So we're going to look at the kettlebell swing. I actually call it the kettlebell hinge and punch. I feel like what we say matters when we cue. And so by calling it a hinge and punch, it reinforces in the athlete's mind that they need to hinge at their hips and then punch forward with their hips rather than swing. I think the athletes associate that with swinging the kettlebell up with their arms. As an aside though, so now we're going to look at some movement errors that you might see typically with a kettlebell swing or a kettlebell hinge and punch. So Taylor's going to grab this kettlebell here and show you this common error. And it's really, again, it's squatting her hinge, right? So she's trying to produce power on the kettlebell, she's trying to swing it, and she's getting into a squat position, and her arms are really long and loose, right? Which is not really what we want to see. We want to generate force with the posterior chain to move that kettlebell and snap it back down nice and fast, okay? So what we can do now is constrain the environment in this way. So we've got two DC blocks here. These are 2 inches tall each, so we've got 2 for Taylor. That's 4-inch raise on her center of mass. Now what we're going to do, before we were constraining the environment in front of a body part, so either her knee, shin, or a shoulder, but now actually what we're going to do is we're going to constrain the environment based on the implement. So we're constraining at the bottom of the kettlebell. So I'm going to put this foam roller right beneath the bottom of the kettlebell there. And what's going to happen is when Taylor's doing her movements, you'll see that she'll get some good ones to begin with. She's keeping her shank vertical, she's hinging at her hip. But as she gets into the movement, those things kind of fly out the window and she starts to squat again. As she starts to squat, the bottom of the kettlebell will come closer to the ground, closer to the foam roller, and the foam roller will provide the feedback that she's moved back into a poor movement pattern. So you'll see it right here. She's got some good ones to begin with, butt backwards, she's got her shin vertical, she starts losing it, and all of a sudden, you see the foam roller provides the feedback that she needs, that she's starting to squat her hinge pattern. Okay, it's pretty dramatic, obviously, seeing the foam roller fall forward, but the problem with this is you only get one piece of feedback. As soon as the foam roller has been hit, okay, she may have another 5 to 10 reps left, and there's no longer any feedback there. So there are a couple other ways that we can achieve something similar to this with a PVC pipe. So as mentioned with the previous constraints-based piece of coaching, that foam roller provides the feedback, but only once, and therefore it's not perhaps the greatest tool. So what we can do is we can have a more continuous feedback loop using a super simple setup with this PVC pipe. Luckily with these Sorinex racks, they have holes drilled in at multiple different levels, so we can just slide a PVC pipe in dependent on the height of the athlete and use this in a similar way. So Taylor, again, is straddling the constraints-based piece of equipment, this time the PVC pipe, and she's going to do exactly the same thing. So our kettlebell hinge and punch. All right, she's doing pretty well so far. As she gets lower and starts to bend those knees and forget those cues, she hits the PVC pipe, she hears it, she feels it, she corrects herself, keeps going, slice it again. Okay, so it's providing that continuous feedback to keep that kettlebell high up by keeping the shin vertical and pushing her hips backward to load the posterior chain. So pretty simple one there. While all of these constraints-based pieces of coaching are useful in their own right and have their own unique spin on coaching, really we can achieve all that we've just done by just using 2 PVC pipes. So we'll demonstrate this here. This is the same as the last one you just saw. The PVC pipe is inserted into the rack here. We're going to use the kettlebell hinge and punch because it's a more dynamic movement. The PVC pipe here is constraining the bottom of the kettlebell, which is helping her keep her shins vertical and leading with her hips backwards. And then simply I'm going to use this PVC pipe, put it in front of her shins to help her keep her shins upright if she's having a problem with that. So I'm right here, 2 PVC pipes, and she's just going to perform those reps. I'm all the way cueing her not to push her shins forward, touching my pole. If she has a problem leading with her shoulders, keep going, Taylor, then I might come back up here and place this in front of her shoulder and say, don't touch my pipe. Okay, exactly the same thing.